Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the American Enterprise Institute. Thank you for joining us today, where we're going to talk about the World Radiocommunications Conference that just happened last year. My first guest today is Steve Lang. He is the Deputy Assistant Secretary for International Information and Communication Policy in the Bureau of Cyberspace and Digital Policy. Does that all fit on one card?
Yes, it does.
He has held this post since November of 2022. He was also the lead for the U.S. delegation for the World Radio Conference. So that is the main reason why he's here today. But listening to his bio, you can realize he could probably talk about anything. Previously, Steve served as the Minister Counselor for Economic Affairs at the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo from titles. You've got it down. And as the Director of both the Office of Multilateral Affairs and the Office of Bilateral Regional Affairs. From 2013 to 2015, Steve was a political counselor at the U.S. Embassy in Mexico City. Prior to that, he served as the Deputy Director of the Office of Chinese and Mongolian Affairs at the Department of State, and as a Senior Analyst in the U.S. Trade Representative's Office on Japan, Korea, and the APEC affairs. Prior tours included U.S. Consulate General in Guangzhou, China, and the American Institute in Taiwan and Taipei, the Bureau of Western Hemispheres, and the U.S. Embassy in Bangkok, and the U.S. interest sections in Havana, Cuba. Before joining state, Steve worked as as an economist in the Department of Labor and he was a graduate of Georgetown University. So you have covered both the southern and northern hemisphere. You've got it pretty down. Well, no, mostly northern hemisphere actually, but
mostly Latin America and Asia.
Yeah. Fabulous. All right. So let's just start with some basics. I know telecom geeks care about this a lot, but every 4 years there is a World Radiocommunications Conference. What is the goal of that?
So the World Radiocommunication Conference is held under the auspices of the International Telecommunication Union, or ITU, and the goal of the conference is to harmonize radio frequency spectrum allocations around the world systems, and they also do the work that allows satellites to operate globally and communicate with each other and with those of us on the ground.
So when you look at something like the maritime system or aviation, that is where the harmonization comes into this, and that is agreed to by governments, not just the industry?
Yes. So governments come together at the WRC, and it is a treaty-level conference. So we negotiate the radio regulations, which decide which bands will be used for which purposes, and that is what ensures that those systems can operate internationally. And at the same time, it's important because those allocations also create economies of scale for manufacturers who are producing that equipment. And so it drives billions of dollars of investment, and there's very large industry interest in the event. And we actually had a delegation of just about 200 people for the United States, and about half of those were private sector advisors.
Wow, that's fantastic. That's always good to have. So kind of explain how that works. Because I have some familiarity with it, but for the audience, I mean, what do these 200 people do, and are they all there to help you?
They are all there to help move our delegation forward and advance our priorities. So there are multiple meetings taking place all the time, and it's U.S. government officials who are speaking for the United States and sitting in the chair in the meetings, but there are private sector advisors who are with them all the time and advising them, and participate in many of the preparatory meetings and the process that develops our positions as we head into the conference.
So how do the decisions that are made in this conference, how are they implemented once you leave? So you have these discussions, they're forward-looking. You're looking at where you're going to be making decisions about spectrum specifically, in different areas. So you basically put to bed what was done in the last 4-year conference, and then you start looking forward. And then as soon as you leave the conference, you just start with those goals and then go home and figure it out?
So each conference sets the agenda for the next conference. Okay. So at this conference, we identified agenda items for WRC 27, and the work on that actually began immediately after the conference ended. So I got to go home after WRC 23 ended, but some of my colleagues had to stay for a few extra days to begin work on the preparatory process for the next conference and to divvy up the work for those new agenda items.
So what were some of the big impact items?
Well, maybe I can tell you a little bit about what the U.S. top-line priorities were for the conference. We went in with broadly 3 buckets of priorities. First of all, we wanted to do work that would expand connectivity and drive innovation. We wanted to unlock the space economy and for the next generation of space science. And we also wanted to, at the same time, make sure that we were protecting our national defense interests and preserving aviation and maritime safety spectrum as well. Under that first category of innovation and connectivity, we wanted to harmonize spectrum available for 5G, especially in our region of the Americas. The ITU divides the world into 3 different regions, and North and South America sit in region 2. So in that category, we were able to ensure identifications for international mobile telecommunications, which is basically 5G or advanced wireless systems, in the 3.3 to 3.4 gigahertz band and the 3.6 to 3.8 gigahertz band. And for Region 2, that created 500 contiguous megahertz of spectrum for 5G, which really creates those economies of scale that can drive investment for manufacturers, but also gives governments the flexibility to choose where they want to allocate spectrum for 5G within that band, depending on their own particular national situations. At the same time, because some of that band is used for radio location systems that are important to national defense, we were able to ensure that in the 3.3 to 3.4 gigahertz band, those radio location services have what we call a super primary status. And we added a footnote to the radio regulations, which ensures that new IMT services won't cause interference for, and they won't claim protection for interference from those radio location services as well, to help make sure that we are defending our national security interests at the same time as we're identifying the spectrum for 5G. But also, we were looking forward to the future, and we wanted to make sure there was a future agenda item that would help lead the way to a pipeline for 6G services as well. In addition to that, it's not just these 5G and 6G licensed services that are important to connectivity. For the United States, unlicensed services like Wi-Fi are also a high priority. So one of our top objectives was to make sure that the 6 gigahertz band remains available for Wi-Fi and other unlicensed services. And there, we had some good successes. We were able to ensure no change for the radio regulations for our region of Region 2, which will allow us to continue to use Wi-Fi in that band here. In Region 3, there was the top 100 megahertz of that band was allocated for IMT, but the rest of the band was not. And notably, China tried to add its name to a footnote that would have created an IMT allocation for the rest of the band in China, but was not able to do that at this conference. Region 1, which is Europe, Africa, the Middle East, and the countries of the former Soviet Union, that region did go with an IMT allocation for the 6.425 to 7.125 gigahertz band. But notably, in a footnote, it was made clear that the band would also be available for other mobile services, including radio local area networks like Wi-Fi. So across the board, we feel like we had good results on that 6 gigahertz band.
I always feel like one of the challenges talking about spectrum is you can't see it, and it's so cool, and it does all this amazing stuff. So in my head, I compare it to the Australians are really big on asset recycling. So I think about it like, do we still need this gigantic, car garage over here when we don't have as many people coming into work? Maybe we can use that better. And so that's literally in my head how I have to think about these things, because I can't see what we're talking about. And I feel like that's a little bit of what we've been up to, where you're saying, okay, I mean, we did this when we dealt with unpacking back with media. So trying to talk everyone else into going in the same way forward, especially I just came back from the Consumer Electronics Show a week ago. And so you have like I was in the Samsung booth and I was talking to the other companies and they were, excited about some of the things that came out of this because it means they now can, put their plans going forward. But where are the areas where we don't have agreement? Because that seems like that's a real challenge for the people that are the manufacturers, as well as maybe some of the new technologies that we'd like to see move forward, and there's others that are not as interested in it as we are.
Yeah, I think, well, there are lots of areas of disagreement, and some of them are on very technical aspects, but I think broadly speaking, I would say one area where there are different views and different priorities is this question of licensed versus unlicensed services. And in the United States, we have made spectrum availability for unlicensed services like Wi-Fi a priority. U.S. industry and U.S. developers are very strong in creating Wi-Fi and other unlicensed service applications. At the same time, we do want to prioritize, though, domestically as well, making sure that we have spectrum available for licensed services. But I think other countries have not prioritized the unlicensed piece of that as much as we have. Another area where we saw some conflict was in satellite issues. We have made it a priority to create the environment that will enable new non-geostationary orbit systems or low Earth orbit systems like Starlink or Amazon Kuiper's system that will provide broadband connectivity, especially for remote areas with low latency. And we saw a lot of resistance, and in fact, I would even say an unfortunate bias against these NGSO systems and some of the proposals that we had across different issues in the conference that were related to NGSO systems. So that was another area where you see different sets of priorities that I think is worth highlighting.
And what creates the conflict? Is it just a path forward? Is they're on a different way that they want to manage their design of equipment, or they just don't see the need for the same spectrum bands?
Well, I think all the countries that are there are trying to advance their own economic interests and the interests of their industries. They're trying to advance their technological leadership. They're trying to advance their national security interests as well. So some countries may have a particular strength in one industry or another. I think, as I mentioned before, the U.S. has we're leading in many ways in the development of these NGSO systems, and are doing very well in developing unlicensed or technologies that rely on unlicensed spectrum applications. But then you have, as well, you have other interests. For instance, with regard to NGSO systems, some countries were concerned about the impact that large mega constellations could have on radio astronomy. Or they were concerned about the future availability of orbital or spectrum resources for systems that we're not thinking of yet. So there are different reasons why there might be different points of view depending on where we're competitive or what we're prioritizing.
So China had a different perspective on 6 gig than we did. What was the issue there with 6 gig?
Well, with 6 gigahertz, China had a proposal for it to be studied for an IMT allocation for the WRC 27, and Chinese industries, Chinese companies, including Huawei, have bet heavily on investment in development of equipment that uses that spectrum. They are not as interested in prioritizing the development of unlicensed spectrum as we are. So there was a strong interest from them in harmonizing the world around 6 gigahertz for future 6th generation 6G technology and for IMT. But we were happy that we were able to make progress in preserving that band of spectrum and to try to make sure that it's harmonized for unlicensed uses.
And so does that interfere with what we want to do on Wi-Fi, or is that just we're taking different paths?
Yeah, it's different paths, and we're going to have to continue to watch it and continue to try to do what we can to make sure that that's as harmonized as possible globally for unlicensed services the way that we would like to align it. But it's going to be an issue that's we'll have to continue to watch and continue to work on.
So looking ahead in 4 years, what spectrum bands or services do you think we will be looking at at that point? I mean, are we? It seems like we just keep finding a new frontier, which I think is amazing.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I think there will be new technologies that we're not thinking of yet. What I think I can say is that we're going to see the same things that we saw at this conference, but more of it. There's going to be interest in spectrum for 6 gigahertz, but it's just going to be harder and harder to find that spectrum because it's a finite resource, and there are so many applications competing for it. We're going to see, I think, a lot more satellite-related issues as we have more and more applications and more constellations going up, and those issues are going to continue to get more challenging. So it's, like I said, I think it's going to be this. One thing we're going to see is the same issues we saw now, but just more challenging and more competition for limited spectrum. So as I mentioned, the process has already begun to prepare for the next conference. We're working on it hard within the U.S. government. We've already had our first discussions about how we're going to coordinate this process, and we're going to have to make sure that we're engaging around the world to listen to the priorities of our partners and competitors and to try to convince them to align with the priorities that we've set for ourselves.
So I ran into a colleague the other day, and she was talking about lunar. She was very excited. What is she? I didn't tell her I didn't know what she was talking about.
Yeah, and I didn't really mention. I mentioned that one of our bucket of issues was space science and the space economy, but didn't talk about some of the achievements that we had there, which I think are super cool. My favorite topic of the conference was our future agenda item proposals. So for the next conference in 2027, one of the topics will be communications on the moon, and we'll be looking at making sure that there's spectrum available and the regulatory framework for how that spectrum will be used for long-term human and robotic presence on the moon. So I think that's super cool. We also had a proposal on space weather, which is very important. And then we had the many different satellite issues that we worked on. We had new allocations for both GSO and NGSO systems in the 17 gigahertz band. And we did make some progress on regulatory frameworks to allow those systems to coexist. And we have a commitment as well to do additional technical studies to look at the framework for how they can coexist in the future as well. So there'll be a lot more work on that front, but space science, the space economy is a really critical topic for the conference, and one where we had some good successes at this one.
I know a lot of people are obsessed with talking about the weather, but now I have to add space weather to that. What do you mean space weather? What does that mean?
Well, I'm not the best person. I'm a diplomat. I'm not
I'm like, are we going to agree that it's raining on Mars and everybody's got to watch what's going on? My mind doesn't know where to go there.
And radiation from the sun and those kinds of things that can interfere with satellite operations and can affect manned spaceflight and other spaceflight operations. And yes, so we're going to study how our satellite systems can monitor space weather and make sure that we're prepared to deal with it.
And then we share that information. It's not going to be like apps where,
Well, the conference was talking about the spectrum that we use to monitor space weather. So what we do with that spectrum is something you're going to have to ask somebody else.
I'm always fascinated that the NOAA app asked me if it's raining right now. And I'm like, you're NOAA. Shouldn't you know if it's raining right now? It's fascinating. And then, so going back to the very beginning of that question, so deciding how we're going to communicate information off the moon, is that what lunar?
Well, it's preparing for a long-term presence there.
Okay.
So as programs like the Artemis program that the United States government is pursuing with partners around the world, as we plan for additional manned spaceflight, manned exploration of the moon, we want to make sure that they can use the telecommunication systems that we rely on here on Earth, and want to make sure that if there are multiple entities trying to use spectrum on the moon, that they are coordinated and harmonized, and that we have a system in place to do that. So that's the plan. We're going to study that and make sure that we can come up with that framework at the next conference.
So coming back here to Earth, so after you finished this whole discussion, and as you said, you got to come home, but a lot of people had to stick around and do the finishing work. How was it received back here? people pretty happy with the response on things, or?
Yes, I would say they have been very happy. We are happy with the results. We feel like across these priorities that we set for ourselves, we achieved progress. The way things came out were not always exactly as we envisioned. It was a negotiation, so there was some give and take. But in each of the areas that we prioritized, we did see progress. And I think most of our industry stakeholders feel like they got things that they needed out of the conference. Our government stakeholders felt like their interests were protected. There are, as I mentioned, a lot of areas where we're going to have to remain vigilant and watch how the agenda develops, the studies are undertaken for the next conference. But we were very happy with the outcome.
So give us a flavor of what it's like to negotiate against, well, not against, but you're in the room and there's some discussion with, we'd hear that France and Iran and China were together on something. That would just immediately make me a little suspicious. Like, I would just be like, what are y'all up to over there in the corner? And do I want to be in that corner with you?
Well, we do. We have like-minded partners that we worked with very closely, and in general, our interests were very aligned at the WRC. We do have competitors and adversaries that we have differences with, and sometimes those came out in our negotiations, and we were on opposite sides of the table. I will note that sometimes it's not always as you might expect. Some of our competitors and adversaries are interested in protecting the same spectrum used for defense applications that we're using. So it's not always cut and dry, but in general, we work closely with our like-minded partners to achieve shared objectives. I will just also note that I think that this is important not just because we want to preserve our economic competitiveness and our technological leadership, because it's important to our economic prosperity and our national security, but also because leadership in these areas of technology also will have an impact on how these technologies are used. And we want to make sure that the U.S. maintains leadership along with our like-minded allies so that these technologies are used with a rights-respecting approach that is aligned with our democratic values. So in addition to the huge economic and security impacts of the conference, I think it's important to advancing our democratic interests as well.
So, the security is an interesting point because I realize we always have the struggle here. There's certain things when somebody brings up security or Department of Defense, you just have to get, okay, I believe you. I can't really go as far. I don't have clearance, so I can't really talk about that. How do you have those discussions at that stage? Are they just things that are tabled and not brought up there, or they just have certain groups that are able to discuss that? Because security is obviously a big part of what is a selling point for 5G in the way that we design next generation networking. So is that something that you're able to talk about out loud? Is that how does that go down?
Well, some of our positions in the end are determined by the U.S. government, and some of the final deliberations are undertaken in a USG-only environment without our private sector advisors in the room. We do have to take in some important Department of Defense and national security interests as we make those decisions about our positions. We had a large Department of Defense component to our delegation as well, and consulted regularly throughout the process. It was an ongoing process that began that continues throughout the cycle. The Department of Defense will participate in our preparations up until the next conference. And I'll note that, I mean, it really is. It's often a challenging balancing act to make sure that we're protecting all of our interests across the board. And it's hard too because there are we want to make sure that our military has the spectrum that they need for their operations, but it's also important to our national security to make sure that we maintain our technological leadership that the private sector is often driving. So they're hard questions to resolve sometimes.
Oh, all right. We have a couple minutes for questions. Do I have a mic runner? Kate, you got? Okay. So be thinking here for 15 seconds. All right. Who has questions? Who wants to be first? Did we answer them all already? Really? You guys are so polite.
I'll ask a question.
Okay.
This is a dumb question.
Can you wait for the mic here? And do you mind introducing yourself?
My name is Joe Freeman, and I'm merely a user. I don't have any relationship to the industry. And this is a dumb question I wasn't going to ask, but you're a little short on questions. Please explain what you mean by 5G and 6G. I keep hearing Xfinity advertising 10G, and I find myself saying, are they implying that they are that much advanced over everyone else, or does it mean something else?
Well, it's a good question because we do throw around these abbreviations and acronyms all the time. 5G is the latest generation, the G is for generation, of your cell phone service that is being rolled out, that has been largely rolled out in the United States and is being rolled out around the world. 6G is the next generation that we're expecting, I think, around 2030 to begin to roll out. So we are identifying the frequencies now for 6G. I suspect the Xfinity ad may be referring to the gigabytes instead of the generation. It gets a little bit confusing because we were talking also about the 6 gigahertz band, which we're protecting for other uses besides 6G. But for this conversation, 6G is that next generation of cell phone service.
So we'll take it back a couple generations, and it'll give you some context to it. So if you travel places that don't have the same level of cellular telecommunications that we have here, you'll very quickly realize the apps on your phone won't work because there's just the capability. Like I was in Vietnam. Went from Kuala Lumpur, which is really excited. They were on 4G, which is pretty much what we are leaving now and going towards 5G. And things worked pretty much the same. And then I left Kuala Lumpur, went to Vietnam, and my phone basically became pretty dumb pretty fast. And the other thing was you forget that you're used to using the hop onto Wi-Fi, and so you would be in the hotel and you'd think you would leave there and use your map system to go somewhere, and as soon as you walk out the door, your maps don't work on your phone anymore. And it's just you've gotten so used to the ubiquitous information flow that we have off our devices. Those generational is just a decision sometimes by, and this is why the World Radio Conference is so interesting, is a lot of them are not at the same location and speed and ability that we are in our systems here. So those are, when you think about 3G and 4G, 3G's, was really just sort of the advent of a smarter phone. And then we went to 4G, which allowed us to have this whole app economy that we're working on. We're currently in 5G, and it is 100% confusing that we use 6G in different ways in the same paragraph. Apologize for that. And 10G, I do think, is a lovely advertising ploy to tell us they're fast. Yep. Okay. Other questions over here?
Thank you so much.
Jeff,
we heard
you want
a
to
lot.
Introduce yourself?
Yes, Jeff Wessing, American Action Forum. We heard a lot leading into the conference that we don't really have our shit together on spectrum issues in the U.S.
Is that a technical term?
That is a technical term.
Okay,
Term of art, actually. But that we just needed to get our auction authority renewed so that you would be able to go on the conference. Did you find that was actually the case? Obviously, we didn't get the authority passed before you went and negotiated. Was that, and did that impact you at all, or were you able to do what you wanted to do regardless?
We were able to do what we needed to do. I don't think I have a comment as a State Department employee on the auction authority question. I will say that the United States government released the National Spectrum Strategy shortly before the conference, and that was helpful to us, and it was helpful to us in finalizing some of our final positions, like our proposal for a future agenda item on IMT identifications for consideration in the next conference, and I think also just to set the stage for U.S. plans for the future spectrum. So I think that was a helpful step.
Last question? All right. Nathan, introduce yourself.
Yes, Nathan Lemur, Fixed Gear Strategies. I am curious about going back to what you talked about earlier with the actual experience of being in Dubai. And the fact is that you're based here. You're how many hours ahead? It's several weeks long. What is what I envisioned the Star Wars, Senate looked like? How does that work? I just kind of was curious, if you could talk a bit more about what that experience back and forth was.
Sure. So it was at a conference facility in Dubai, and there were multiple rooms ranging in size from the full plenary where we could fit large delegations, pretty much everybody there in one room, to smaller, much smaller meeting rooms, and there was a schedule each day. The conference, I guess I can explain. The conference is divided into seven different committees that meet regularly and move their products up through to the plenary session, which gives them final approval. And the committee has working groups and there are sub-working groups, and so it's a process of moving these documents up through that chain. There are really three substantive committees that are moving the proposals, and then there's a budget committee and there's a translation committee or editorial committee. And so we are tracking our proposals as they get introduced in the committee and then assigned to working groups. And we're making sure that we have people in each of these groups, and we're watching as they move from a drafting group to a sub-working group to a working group to the committee, and then they get moved up to the plenary. And we're trying to track them as they go along. We're trying to make sure that we have the right people in each of those meetings each day. We would have, on most days, we would have either a full delegation meeting first thing in the morning, or usually more often we'd have a smaller delegation meeting, often just the core U.S. government delegation meeting to plan the day and figure out what we needed to keep an eye on. And the first week of the conference, we have a lot of high-level visitors who are there. There are more receptions and things like that. Documents are introduced, but not a lot of the work is being done. People are trying to figure out what others' positions are. The second week, things begin to heat up, and you start to see things begin to move. But not many decisions are made. And then the third week, some of the easier stuff starts to get approved and to come off the agenda. But really, a lot of the tough issues don't get resolved until that last week. And then there's more of a scramble. There were several days in a row of meetings last until 3 in the morning the last few nights. And then you get the last few things done, and the last day is just signing documents and making sure that all the I's are dotted and T's are crossed.
Do they hold the hard questions to the end because you can't get people to resolve them until they're exhausted, or?
Yeah, I mean, basically, that's part of it, but it's also because people hold back on what they know the other negotiators want until they think they're going to get the maximum that they can. So everybody's holding back on what is important to everybody else until we can come up with a bigger deal.
Fantastic. Steve, thank you for joining us for this part of the show. It's just, we're going to need a couple minutes to set up for the panel, so just give us a few minutes for those of you who are watching online, those in the room, grab some coffee. Steve, thank you so much. I really appreciate you being here today.
It's great.
Thanks. One of these things that was really kind of a personal curiosity. I was like, what? Thank you, Nathan, for asking the question. Was I'm like, what do they do for 3 weeks? And then you talk to people and you'd find out more and more of what was going on. So let me just quickly introduce everybody. Sorry, get my stuff there. Sorry, I'm going to go out of order because these are just the order they're in here. Michael O'Reilly. Oh, you actually are on the end. Mike O'Reilly is a former commissioner from the Federal Communications Commission from 2013 to 2020. Mike is a member of APCO International Advisory Council and a principal at MP O'Reilly Consulting. He's also a visiting fellow at the Hudson Institute for the Center of Economics of the Internet and a senior fellow at the Media Institute. He is a leading subject matter expert on policies related to technology, telecommunications, and communications. Before being unanimously confirmed by the FCC, Mike held a variety of leading staff positions during 20 years on Capitol Hill in both the U.S. Senate and House of Representatives, ending as a policy advisor in the office of Senate Republican Whip, then led by U.S. Senator John Cornyn. He previously worked for the Republican Policy Committee in the U.S. Senate and was a policy analyst for banking, technology, transportation, trade, and commerce issues from 2009 to 2010. Prior to this, Commissioner O'Reilly worked in the office of Senator John Sununu as a legislative director and as a senior legislative assistant. Before his tenure as a Senate staffer, he served on the professional staff of the Committee on Energy and Commerce in the United States House of Representatives from 1998 to 2003 as a telecommunications policy analyst from 1995 to 1998. He began his career with U.S. Congressman Tom Bliley, God rest his soul, who we just lost last year, from 1994 to 1995. So welcome, Mike. Sorry, going out of order here. Evelyn Romali is a partner at the law firm Wilkinson Barker Nauer, where she spearheads an effort on broadband funding and cybersecurity and spectrum management. Evelyn most recently served as the acting assistant secretary of the acting assistant secretary of Commerce and Communications and Information and acting administrator of the National Telecommunications and Information Administration. At NTIA, Evelyn led a team of experts providing senior policy guidance to the Secretary of Commerce and the White House on government priorities, including broadband funding to close the digital divide, supply chain risk management, privacy, free flow of information, encryption, spectrum, and the Internet of Things. Prior to her work with the federal government, she led a cybersecurity and internet policy team at Booz Allen Hamilton in McLean, Virginia. Evelyn also worked as a leading internet service provider in the internet privacy and security federal practice and spent time deploying internet across communities throughout her work in public libraries. Thank you for that. I love my library. Umair Javid joined CTIA, the Wireless Industry Association, as the Senior Vice President for Spectrum Policy to shape and coordinate the organization's spectrum advocacy. Umair comes to CTIA from the Federal Communications Commission, where he was Chief Counsel in the Office of Chairwoman Jessica Rosenworcel and played a central role in shaping our nation's spectrum policy as he helped focus the agency on identifying mid-band spectrum for 5G. He also oversaw one of the most successful auctions in the U.S. history and launched the FCC's Spectrum Coordination Initiative to enhance partnership between agencies and the private sector. Prior to the FCC, Umair was an attorney at Wiley Ryan from 2010 to 2017. Kate O'Connor is the Chief Counsel for the Subcommittee on Communications and Technology with the U.S. House of Representatives Committee on Energy and Commerce. Kate previously served as the Chief of Staff for the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, or NTIA, where she served on legislative and communication policy focused on spectrum and broadband issues, including the Office of Congressional Affairs, where she engaged with Congress, state government officials, and other federal agencies to advance the administrative's legislative initiative on broadband and 5G. Prior to joining NTIA, Kate worked on the United States Senate in the office of Senator Mark Kirk and Senator Dan Sullivan, where she handled issues before the Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation, including the Telecommunications Subcommittee. And Tracy, I just wrote your name down, Buese. Biswayze. All right, sorry. I'm gonna. By the time I'll say it 8 million times, I'll get it. Joined NCTA recently as the legal team and vice president and associate and general counsel last March, where priorly she was at Meta and served as associate general counsel in telecommunications and regulatory affairs. In this position, she worked on network infrastructure and connectivity teams to navigate domestic and international telecommunications, competition, data protection, privacy law, regulating concerns of terrestrial and submarine cable networks, new terrestrial and non-terrestrial connectivity solutions, metaverse-ready networks, and network generation OTT services. Before joining Meta, she was a senior counsel at Ring Central, where she led the U.S. on international regulatory and legal matters concerning VoIP services. Previous to that, she was an associate at Harris, Wilshire, and Grannis, and a law clerk for the Honorable Curtis V. Gomez in the United States District Court of the Virgin Islands. So we have quite a team here. I think we could pretty much solve any problem. I want you all to be like, on my next time I play telecommunications trivia. So thank you for coming here to talk about what happened at work. Since we started and had some fun talking to our previous speaker about satellites, I'm going to start with satellites for 100, Mike. With the new low Earth orbit satellite networks expanding, and there's a lot of interesting debate that has been happening at work, that I didn't realize that they needed to update 25-year-old rules of the road, as they called them, for using certain frequencies. So can you walk us through, as we're expanding into space, what is it that we need on the spectrum, through the spectrum pipeline for space, and how are we managing that? Because it's something that's relatively new, and we haven't really thought about it in the spectrum space prior to this.
Well, thanks for having me, and thanks for reading my entire bio. You forgot
You know what?
that
I was so excited to see it.
I started as a grocery store produce clerk. But no, so satellite was probably, and I think Ambassador Lang referenced it, but it's probably I would say the second most important issue that was talked about, or the most controversial issue overall that was brought to WRC. And it didn't need to be, because what it was seeking, and what you referenced, is the fact that I'll call them power levels, EPFD, our power levels for how our LEO satellites operate in same bands or similar interference issues with our GEOs. And I love the GEOs, for those that are out there and supportive and operate in that space. That's great. The reference is that the power limits are 25 years old, and LEO's built for a different LEO system long ago. When my career referenced, I was there. And now the world has changed. We have new LEOs that are coming on board. We have operational LEOs, and they're really exciting what they're able to bring to consumers. And so the question that was presented to WRC is, shouldn't we change the power limits that are brought forward? And the resolution was a good outcome, I think, relatively, to lead to technical review that will examine this particular issue and determine what should be accepted, or what can be, how far we can go on power limits, so we can make sure that GEOs are fully protected, but we can get the maximum we can out of LEOs. And that's a good outcome overall, and then we'll see where those studies go. I suspect, as someone who's operated in this space for a long time, no pun intended, is that the limits usually are very conservative, and then as things develop, as experience goes, we can change those. And I envision that those technical studies will be positive. In the end, we'll eventually be able to move the boundaries.
So for those who are just getting into this game, will you please explain what a LEO and a GEO is?
Sure, they're really just it's really what level or how far away from the Earth are you operating? LEOs is a low Earth, middle Earth for MEOs, and GEOs is geosynchronous. They're on the top, and it's really how far away from the Earth are you, and how many satellites do you need to cover to cover operations? So GEOs need quite a number fewer than LEO, which has can operate into the thousands depending on the business plan of the operator.
And how did they felt like they fared through this? Did they get what they wanted going into the World Radio Conference?
Well, the satellite industry is unique. They are very entrenched and very involved in WRC, and have been for an awful long time. The GEOs certainly have been operating. They operate globally, and so they have a great relationship. So I think overall people are happy where things ended, and then we'll see how those technical studies result in terms of the power limits. Obviously we're going to have some tension between different parts of the satellite industries and with satellites and others. That's natural to be had on spectrum issues. But I think overall things are trending in the right direction, and those technical studies will prove out to be positive.
So Umair, from the U.S. perspective, what were the key spectrum band services that were prioritized going into WRC 23, and do you feel like we were successful in furthering those priorities?
Sure. Is this on?
I think try again. They should all
There
be
we
on.
go.
There we
Is
go.
that better?
Yep.
Okay. Well, thanks, Shane, and it's great to be here. Before I was at CTIA, I was at the FCC, as you mentioned, and I helped with the U.S. government's preparation for the World Radiocommunication Conference. And since joining CTIA, I went to Dubai for the first part of the conference. I was in the lucky position of having seen this develop from both places. And in both places, I grounded my work in this idea that we're better off when more people are connected. I believe that when I was at the FCC for the country. I believe that for the industry now that I'm CTIA, that we're better off when more people are connected. And that's what I saw in Dubai. Das Lang did an amazing job right before our panel talking about the U.S. positions and going in and how they fared. So I'm going to focus a little bit on the second half of that equation, which is what was happening in the rest of the world. What were the trends? What were the positions that they were bringing into the conference? And why were they important? And what did it mean for the United States? And what I saw in Dubai, where over 160 countries had gathered, was that for many of these countries, reliable internet and mobile connections are still a challenge. If you look at the ITU data, internet penetration has reached 95% of population coverage in only 13 countries worldwide. And not surprisingly, a lot of the gap in many of these countries is in rural and remote areas. If you zoom into Africa, for example, 4G coverage in urban areas is about 4 times what it is in rural and remote areas. That's a problem we know a lot about here in the United States. And this is important because a lot of countries came to this conference with an agenda. They wanted to use this conference to make progress in closing the digital divides in their borders. And they knew that to do that, they would have to make more spectrum available to support mobile. And they knew that in order to get the most bang for their buck, that they would have to support harmonized spectrum. They would have to support full power, mid-band spectrum that could support wide area deployments and start to chip away at the digital divides that they're still struggling with in their countries. And so a lot of countries came to this conference looking for outcomes. I think this is important because so much of what happened at the conference and what happened with the US positions can be explained by the simple idea that the United States did not have an answer for these countries about where they should go to find that spectrum. But other countries did. And that dynamic, I think, has consequences, not just for our global competitiveness, but also for our national security. And so when we talk about sort of how did the US fare at this conference, I think we look at the positions that the US went in with and sort of the outcomes that we came out with at the conference. Traditionally, the United States has really benefited from leading global discussions about spectrum policy, right? We do the work on our side to have a positive agenda of what we want spectrum policy to look like for ourselves and for the countries that follow us. We spend the weeks leading up to the conference really shoring up diplomatic relationships with our regions and with the rest of the world. And then we go to the conference and we seek to get alignment around that view. This time around, domestic disputes about spectrum policy, about how we should use spectrum at home, really sidelined the United States in conversations at the World Radiocommunication Conference about what the world should be doing with spectrum. And that meant that the United States wasn't as forceful in these conversations that it has been in the past. And I think there were 2 big consequences that flowed from that with respect to the spectrum bands. The first being that the United States came out of that conference falling further behind on mid-band spectrum. We went into the conference already trailing our economic peers and our rivals, right? Most countries have access to about 44% more mid-band spectrum than the United States. They left that conference with an opportunity for at least 600, 700 megahertz more mid-band spectrum. And meanwhile, the US does not really have a plan for replacement spectrum. The second big consequence I think we saw is that other countries were filling the gap that the US had left behind. And so we heard from Das Lang about China's interest in 6 gigahertz. Well, we saw that in other places as well. France had identified the 6 gigahertz band as the only high-quality domestic resource they had for future 5G and 6G deployments. They sought to protect that. They were very successful in Region 2, which is Europe, the Middle East, and Africa, in accomplishing that. And they left that conference with not only harmonizing the region along that plan, but also an opportunity for other countries to opt in to using the 6 gigahertz band for 5G and 6G. And we saw a lot of countries in the Asia Pacific take up that opportunity. We saw our two biggest trading partners in our region, Brazil and Mexico, also take that opportunity. So we saw the ability of other countries to shape spectrum policy independently of US priorities at this conference in a way that I don't think we've ever seen before. So these are two consequences that I think we're watching, at least, to see what happens. That said, because of that global interest in finding full power mid-band spectrum, because of the ability of other countries to want to make progress on that issue, we did see some helpful outcomes at this conference. We saw the lower 3 gigahertz band become harmonized across the region 1 and 2, and so this is truly a global 5G band now. We saw 7 gigahertz be identified as a target for future harmonization activity. This is an opportunity for the United States to lead because that's a band that we've identified in our national spectrum strategy as well. So there are these outcomes, I think, from the conference that really start to pave a path for the United States to follow in order to start to close some of the gap between us and other countries on spectrum policy.
So instead of going to another question, does anybody want to do any response thoughts to that? That was a lot. Kate, you kind of looked for like a second. You might have some thoughts on that. Nope.
Me?
Yeah.
Well, I was listening. I have thoughts on domestic
You can.
spectrum
You can.
policy.
We
that
can. We
I think
started with
plays
space and we
into
came
it.
back to Earth. We're good. We can go back to domestic.
Good.
Yeah.
Well, now I'll bring it back from international
yep.
Dubai to the United States. No, I think it's interesting the different points that Umair made, and we were following the World Radiocommunication Conference very closely. One of my bosses, I work for Chairwoman Kathy McMorris Rogers on the Energy and Commerce Committee, and one of her top priorities has been to reauthorize the Spectrum Auction Authority since it expired. One of the big priorities that she had in doing so was also ensuring that the DoD study that was being done and was directed as part of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act was done, appropriately and in accordance with our normal spectrum management feasibility studies, I guess would be the case. And I think, and she introduced, just to back up a little bit, she introduced the Spectrum Auction Reauthorization Act, which would have reauthorized Spectrum Auction Authority for 3 years, made some changes to the directive that was given to the DoD and to Department of Commerce and the infrastructure law in studying the lower 3 gigahertz band, primarily by adding back in NTIA into the process, which was not included in the DoD study as directed by IIJA. That legislation did not pass, and unfortunately, Auction Authority expired. I think some of the things that Umair was talking about in the World Radiocommunication Conference is especially in the 3 gigahertz band, is extremely interesting given where the U.S. has sort of been and now where the administration is going. So the legislation that passed out of committee that we did not pass through the House, that would have made changes to how DoD did the study, but DoD has now released the study and provided it to Congress. And the way that they did the study, I think, was pretty disappointing, and I can speak for our members that there was a lot of concern with some of the results and the testing and the technical parameters that were used to do the study, one of which was that DoD was given $50 million and they studied only sharing opportunities in the current environment that we're operating in. And I think some of the points that Umair touched on with the 3 gigahertz band now being internationally harmonized is for IMT. It's concerning that that is what we studied as the U.S. instead of looking ahead and looking to see what potential clearing and even better sharing opportunities there could be going forward if systems could relocate or the Spectrum Relocation Fund is able to provide funding or an auction brings in enough funding for these systems to relocate into a different band. And so we're looking going forward, what are opportunities that these agencies can study and take in different spectrum bands to be able to best, as their systems upgrade, are there better spectrum bands that are suited for some of these systems that could then make commercial spectrum opportunities available? So we're looking at that going forward. I can say from my boss's perspective, she thinks that making spectrum available for commercial use is an economic security issue, which then plays into promoting our national security. We think that both of those things are extremely important and all systems can coexist, but it's a lot of work. And so we're taking a look. We've been meeting with the agencies, especially post the administration releasing their national spectrum strategy, and I'm hopeful we can make progress in this space.
So Evelyn is one of the few people that get to look in perhaps a little bit inside the black box, or is using my asset recycling perspective. It's like there's a big black building on the corner, and there's secrets in it, but we don't know which ones are important, and do they need all the floors in that building, or does the building, could it be moved? I mean, there's a lot of challenges that you have when you're trying to talk about domestic or international policy, and you don't get to see all the puzzle pieces, right? And so, talk to us a little bit about the security elements, and where can we work through this when you're looking at it from a commercial perspective and not wanting to put anything about our national security in harm, or what can we do to also perhaps strengthen national security while we're looking at spectrum?
Thanks, Shane. And it's so great to be here with so many of my current and former colleagues. It's such an important topic, especially talking about national security at this particular moment. I think that within the USG, we've been a little bit slow to recognize how important spectrum is for national security more holistically, not just about protecting it for our weapon systems, but also the fact that when we are leading on technology, when we're strong globally, when you look at the future of where communications is going, it's all about mobility. And we want to lead in those technologies. We want our companies to lead. When the U.S. has the edge in those technologies, we have a security advantage. We can be sure that our supply chains are trusted, and we can bring other global partners on board with our technology and know that we can trade and share, and that using that communications technology, that our values will be protected in the use of technology. As we all know, technology, especially mobility included, opens up so much of our data to potential exposure, to potential cyber threats. And so again, being sure that we have a trusted supply chain is essential. And again, the U.S. having an edge in those technologies, where technology is going in terms of mobility, which allows things like smart agriculture and autonomous vehicles. That is the future of where technology is going. If the U.S. is not leading in those technologies, we're not leading in the future economy. And that has an impact on our national security. So it's absolutely essential that we are thinking holistically about our spectrum policy, not just for the national security that impacts weapon systems, but this broader soft power issues as well. I would say that within the USG, that second part, we've been a little bit slow to incorporate that into our spectrum decision making. I think one area that you're seeing now within defense, and I spent several years working at the Pentagon in that environment, and this is not just a struggle on the spectrum side. Right now, DoD is looking, for example, to revamp how they do software acquisition. They realized that they were not being agile enough. They realized that there's so much, software as a service that they need to be taking advantage of in the marketplace to actually, again, stay on the cutting edge of where technology is going and to protect the warfighter. They are revamping that. They are revamping how they do software policy and software acquisition. They have, an innovation unit looking at this issue. We have not gotten there yet on the spectrum side. And, we really need to get into that mode that, the spectrum, again, you talked about it being invisible. I think sometimes we forget what a strategic asset it is. But it is so essential for everything that we do on the national security and defense side. And so if we don't start thinking more strategically about the asset, actually looking at the decade that we're in with technology, doing it more agilely, right now we're making spectrum decisions based based on, we're locked into policy because we have systems that, go out into 2030, and we feel that we can't change anything in that time. Well, the next decade, even the national security strategy says that this decade that we're in is the decisive decade for national security. And so if we don't get more agile, start actually taking these issues seriously, and spectrum harmonization, which we were dealing with at WRC, again, is part of the way that we have the edge in technology and national security. We're not going to get there. So we need to revisit how we're doing the decision making. This new spectrum strategy tries to get at some of that, but the implementation plan really needs to address that, and we need to start working on it before the next WRC.
Is that sunk cost, or is that a level of decision paralysis? It's like the decision's been made, I don't want to revisit it, or they're like, I've already spent all, like with software, I know people feel like I've already invested, and they don't understand the maintenance and the upkeep of it. And with Spectrum, are we look at it in a similar way of like, we have to keep thinking new thoughts about how we can be utilizing and reprocessing our priorities on how we use these bands?
We don't incentivize it. We don't, the way that the decision process works is that it's all about, again, protecting those legacy systems. If you're someone who's part of the decision chain, you're not rewarded for trying to get to yes, for being innovative. So we really have to revisit it at every level and start rewarding those individuals who are part of the decision chain to get more innovative, to try to think out of the box in terms of how we can get to a better solution and not just stay in the same place year after year.
I feel like we need to get one of those home organizer ladies that's on HGTV to come in and be like, you're using your closet all wrong. Like, think about it this way, shoes should not be there. So Tracy, come in on this conversation, sorry for that bad segue, to the importance of unlicensed, because it's a little bit of an unsung hero on this panel. We all use it and we like it, but it's a challenged child in this whole thing. It doesn't get some of the same priorities as licensed, and it's fighting for that space. It's fighting for that space in the closet. So tell us about the importance of unlicensed.
Thanks so much, Shane. I'm happy to be here, and I'm just happy to be having this conversation with you all. It's a very important conversation, and would just really like to thank the U.S. delegation of the WRC for doing a great job of protecting U.S. innovation, particularly with regard to Wi-Fi and unlicensed technologies. We're NCTA and our members were happy with the result, as the ambassador spoke about earlier today. 6 gigahertz is the work that's been done in 6 gigahertz is an American success story, and it's important to build on the strengths that we have, that we've already seen in Wi-Fi 6E, and that we'll soon see in the Wi-Fi 7 devices that are rolling out. And it's also important to note that it's focusing on U.S. strengths is it's a good thing. It helps everyone. Focusing on competition and innovation, those are qualities that are good for the world, not just for the U.S. So just wanted to kind of make those notes where we are pleased with how things turned out at the WRC, and look forward to continuing the conversation around what spectrum policy should look like. With the National Spectrum Strategy Implementation Plan, we are especially excited to see how NTIA decides to move forward with the 7 and 8 gigahertz band, or kind of range. We see that there's opportunity for Wi-Fi there. As we look at the 6 gigahertz band, Wi-Fi 7 is able to use channel sizes up to 320 megahertz. And there's a kind of a stranded channel at the top of the 6 gigahertz band of 125 megahertz. If we just continue to extend things up to the bottom of the 7 gigahertz band, that will allow for 4 full 320 megahertz channels, which will really enable Wi-Fi Wi-Fi 7 to realize its full potential, and that comes into play where we see continued advances in VR and AR technologies, as well as other applications and so forth. As Evelyn mentioned, there are a lot of use cases outside of just kind of what we think of as traditional Wi-Fi provision, more kind of private networks where agriculture is able to, agricultural entities are able to set up their own networks using this new technology and really kind of cater their networks to what they need and how they actually need to use the spectrum. And so just wanted to, kind of, as you mentioned, unlicensed sometimes is not as prevalent in these conversations, but certainly is an American success story that I think we all need to continue to tout and look forward to continuing to do so.
Uberielke, you want to jump in on that point?
Sure.
Don't turn your microphone off. Just leave it on.
At the start of this, I saw everyone checking their mics, and I was like, I know how to use a mic. And of course, I've messed it up every time.
Leave it on.
So, I might actually push back a little bit on that idea that unlicensed is fighting for its place as sort of the unloved spectrum child. The United States is leading the world when it comes to unlicensed and shared spectrum. If you look domestically, the availability of unlicensed and shared spectrum in the pivotal midband eclipses licensed use about 4 to 1. In just the past 2 years, we've made about 1,350 megahertz of almost contiguous spectrum available for unlicensed and shared use. I mean, that would be a dream, I think, for licensed use. If you go in the millimeter wave, same story, about 3 to 1 of unlicensed and shared spectrum compared to licensed use. So the United States has made tremendous progress when it comes to unlicensed and shared use. We're leading the world on this metric. There's no one who's even close to catching up on this. And if you remember the conversation just preceding this panel, the U.S. government's top priority going into the World Radiocommunication Conference was preserving its unlicensed decisions. And so I think there's a lot of attention and focus being given there. I think we need to lead the world on both. We need to be leading on unlicensed. We also need to be leading the world on licensed. And I think our domestic spectrum policy decision-making has to reflect what's happening in the rest of the world. And so it's in that licensed mid-band spectrum where the United States faces the biggest gap. We see that gap, I think, from two angles. The first is what I call the keeping up with the Joneses. If you look at what the rest of the world is doing, we're trailing in the availability of mid-band licensed spectrum. And as I said earlier, a lot of countries left the conference with the potential for even more spectrum. The second place where we see the gap is in capacity. So data demand has been growing twofold every 2 years for the past 10 years. Right now, we don't have a pipeline of licensed mid-band spectrum in the United States to continue to keep up with that demand. And that's another thing that we need to address, I think, as a nation. If you look at the World Radiocommunication Conference, the rest of the world has identified that 6 gigahertz band as the home for future 5G and 6G deployments. I think that makes the 7 and 8 gigahertz band uniquely important to the mobile industry in the United States. And this is for a couple of reasons. The first is that the 6 gigahertz band is not available for mobile in the United States because we've allocated that full 1200 megahertz for unlicensed. The 7 and 8 gigahertz band is right next to it. That means that we can get in the same tuning range as that 6 gigahertz band. And that opens up a lot of benefits. It means that we can benefit from economies of scale with deployments in the 6 gigahertz band. It means that we can participate in the equipment market for the 6 and 7 and 8 gigahertz band. And that's really important because if we learned anything in the run-up to 5G, it's that when we don't participate in that equipment market, we create national security risk for ourselves. Because you see companies like Huawei and ZTE being the only supplier available to countries who are deploying in that spectrum. You don't see the development of a secure market for equipment. And that's something we have to change. So I think that we've got to catch up on the licensed mid-band spectrum. We've got to update our policies to reflect what the rest of the world is doing. And we've got to start to make progress on that 7 and 8 gigahertz band.
Which brings us back to domestic and the spectrum pipeline. I know Kate, you worked really hard on it. How does 2024 look?
So a lot has changed since last Congress. We have a new Senate leadership on the Republican side. So And, the DoD study has now been put forward. The World Radiocommunication Conference happened. The White House released their national spectrum strategy. We have started having conversations with the four corners to see what's in the realm of possible. I think something that's really interesting that I've noticed, I've been on the Hill now almost 10 years, or I guess on and off, but almost there. And 10 years ago, having conversations about spectrum was like, this is so boring. We're going to just hotline this, or we'll get this out of Senate Commerce and no big deal. And now you have members on the House side, I can at least speak for, but you have members from other committees that immediately pay attention as soon as a band that a federal agency that's in their jurisdiction is potentially going to be impacted by. And something that I learned when I was at NTIA and experienced, unfortunately, before I even came back to the Hill, was that agencies, and sometimes, these are really tough decisions to make, but agencies hear about potential relocation or potential, for an auction to happen, or the FCC is going to go in and advocate. I was actually at NTIA during the last World Radiocommunication Conference, and that was a huge issue because of power levels. And there were agencies that were engaged because where the U.S. ended up landing was concerning to certain agencies. So it is amazing how even in the last 5 or 6 years, how many people are now paying attention to spectrum policy, which is really technical by nature. And so I'm listening to you guys talk about unlicensed versus licensed, and up on the Hill, I'm not an engineer. I don't pretend to be an engineer. And we always talk about, which I know some people here will probably cringe when I say this, but we always talk about advocating for a balanced spectrum policy. We mean that, and by balance, we think that unlicensed plays a huge role in our economy. We think that licensed plays a huge role in our economy, but there are benefits to different types of spectrum. License, for example, especially coming from a political dynamic, it's an offset for funding. So we can fund things like the Secure and Trusted Communications Networks Act,
Previously known
created
as
the
rip
rip
and
and replace.
replace.
I just immediately go to rip and replace. But that's a huge national security issue that our members have been focused on for a while. Licensed spectrum provides potential opportunity for our committee to be able to fund that. At the same time, we see all the advances that are happening in both licensed and unlicensed, and unlicensed just has more flexibility when you're looking at potential pockets for sharing with federal users or incumbent users. So it's tough. In terms of an outlook, we're optimistic. It is a top priority for my boss. As people here, I'm sure from the agencies that I see know, we are constantly talking with them and bringing them up for briefings with our members. So it is definitely top of mind, and we're hopeful, but we'll see.
So an open question to the whole group of you who spent a lot more time trying to relocate spectrum than I have. I've just been listening to all these conversations. What do you think are the next steps coming? So we've had World Radio Conference. We have an idea globally what we can and can't play with. But so now we're back into our domestic space. What is the best next step? And is that a difference between you two on unlicensed and licensed? Is it a matter of we can't get the feds to move? So, is that an unmovable object? I'm asking a couple questions at once here, but so thoughts on that? Because that seems to be the big question mark is, all right, so what is the chess piece we put out next? And then what are the gains on that? And does that make a difference? Do the economic gains make a difference? Or does it just a matter of who has the biggest black box building that you can't look into? Something like that. Evelyn, do you want to start?
Sure. I think that, so as tough as it is, the WRC did give us some direction, right? The outcomes there. So, we know what happened with the 6 gigahertz, but there was decisions made around 7 gigahertz for IMT, as well as that 3.3 to 3.4, which we've said that we will revisit, have additional study there, even though DoD has already put its report out. So we need to commit to doing that study, taking a look again, seeing if something was missed, what we can uncover. That could be a very, very important piece of the puzzle if we could add something there and find a solution. And then just as Umair was saying, on the 7, because that is so critical for us getting those economies of scale, we need to start working on that immediately. And if there are going to be, issues and disagreements on that path ahead and potential agency issues, we really need to start those conversations and really expedite them now.
Other thoughts?
Yeah, can I jump in on your
Sure.
question?
Yep.
First of all, I could applaud Kate and her team for trying to get auction authority extended. I fully support that. I think everyone who has been involved in trying to figure out how do you get licenses out knows that auctions are the best way to go about it. I do absolutely agree, and no commentary on existing bans that are under discussion, but we are going to need more commercial spectrum, which is more licensed and unlicensed, and that means doing the hard lifting of moving our Department of Defense and making them upgrade and shrinking their footprint. I say that, I've said that for the last many years, as you read my bio. That is not always a popular belief, and it is a very heavy lifting. We talk about breaking eggs, we talk about how hard it is, and you have to push agencies against their wishes, and they do end runs on you to Congress to try and find different avenues to undo sound decisions. We saw that in FAA and C-band. We've seen that many time again. So that's a heavy lift to do, but it's absolutely necessary for the future of commercial wireless advancement. We also need to address the fact that WRC itself has got some problems. And I would also argue, as we're out of we're out of 23, we do need to fix the U.S. approach to WRC. We kind of had a backwards, late last game approach. No disrespect to Ambassador Lang and the work that he was able to do, but he was not the first choice. And the choice even of Commissioner Gomez was long in the process. Other countries don't do that. And you think about who's dominating in WRC today. It's the countries you mentioned. It's Iran, it's Russia, China, France. Those countries dominate this discussion. They aren't our adversary or our allies on these issues. They often do things that are in their geopolitical interest against the United States. So we do need to fix the U.S. proposal or the U.S. approach to WRC. And I think there's some things that need to be done on the ambassador level and ambassadorship level that we could do on legislation. I'd love to talk to Kate about that. We do need to fix some things. We do need to make more mid-band spectrum available for commercial purposes going forward for both sides of the equation. And that means pushing agencies farther than they like. And the idea that the agencies are so sophisticated and they're very up to tune on spectrum policy, I think that's debatable, disputable, given some of the things that we've learned about how our previous DoD spectrum managers were handling the job that they were asked to do.
Tracy, did you want to get in?
Yes, thanks.
Just leave your mics on.
I may have lost power. Okay, but just wanted to say that I do think it's important to look at WRC first and then kind of zoom in domestically. Just one point I wanted to be sure to make is we saw that 6 gigahertz was designated for IMT in a number of places outside of the U.S. However, there is a footnote, as Ambassador Lang mentioned, that says that RLANs and Wi-Fi could also be used in those bands. So it's not a foregone conclusion that those, that 6 gigahertz is certainly going to be an IMT band around the world outside of the U.S. So I think it's important to think about that as we are kind of huddling back in the U.S. and figuring out what is our strategy for the next conference. I think part of that is already kind of teed up for us in the national spectrum strategies. There are some bands that we're looking at. There's has been a great opportunity for industry to provide input on how people think these bands should be studied or whether, and kind of what the timeline and implementation should look like. So I think that kind of next steps are to roll out that implementation and work here on the ground to to hash out things domestically and ensuring that there is a balanced spectrum policy. There is a need for for different types of spectrum and doing that, keeping in mind that coexistence is key, especially where there are these bands where there's federal use and Department of Defense is using spectrum in ways that sometimes is often classified and we can't see behind into that black box. However, we look at the different tools in the toolbox, and there are different ways to coexist with the federal incumbents that are in these various bands. And I think kind of really honing in on that, and coexistence and those bands will help to get to the point of releasing the spectrum for commercial use.
Where?
So first I want to add a plus one to what Commissioner O'Reilly was saying about continuing to think about our preparatory process for the World Radiocommunication Conference. And we were talking about this a little bit before the start of the panel, in that the conference ends, and then you almost sort of don't hear about it again for 4 years, and then there's another mad rush to prepare for it and position ourselves. And so I completely agree that I think we would benefit from keeping some focus on this conference and thinking about how can we adjust processes both domestically and internationally to maximize our success there. Because I think there's room for improvement when we look at ITU processes.
How far ahead do we normally try to put the ambassador in place? Because this seemed exceptionally late, but not abnormally late.
Yeah, so it's it's different between conferences, but I would say within a year before the start of the conference is usually a named ambassador, and Evelyn might have.
They tend to identify somebody to help, but they don't tend to actually send up as they don't want to go through the normal ambassador process. They think it gets difficult in Congress. As someone who's worked on nominations, and my own, I know how that process can work. But so they tend to just have somebody identified, and then later on, towards the end, the president's able to to appoint them without needing Congress's approval. I think you need to fix that process. We should try and prioritize that and address that way ahead. Other countries aren't having temporary ambassadors. I put my money that Ambassador Lang is not going to be working on this issue in 4 years.
I'm not sure he's going to be working on it much after this if he can get away from it.
Yeah, he's going to be in some other country, or somewhere else. So we have to fix that process, and that requires more than just the last couple of minutes saying, okay, here's our ambassador.
And I also want to agree with Tracy in terms of where we go from here. I think we need to start making some progress. I look at 2023 as almost a year of planning with the National Spectrum Strategy, with all the conversations we had about auction authority, with the World Radiocommunication Conference. And so I think 2024 now needs to be a year of action. We need to start actually building on some of the momentum that we have. I think that means Congress restoring auction authority, hopefully with a predictable pipeline of spectrum to support commercial innovation. I think it means NTIA releasing an implementation plan that gives everyone some confidence that these studies that we're going to do over the next 2 years are going to result in some sort of outcome that's workable. And I think it means making progress on the lower 3 and the 7 and 8 gigahertz band, especially.
Kate.
I think this was pretty well covered. One thing I will add is I don't want it to be perceived. I totally agree that Congress should be speaking to these issues and that pressure is going to be necessary to make spectrum available for commercial licensed use. But I also want to be clear that nobody is saying, well, at least from my perspective, my members on the Energy and Commerce Committee that I work for, they are not trying to take away spectrum from the agencies necessarily. So I think that there's a lot of talk of like it's either federal spectrum or it's commercial spectrum, and there's no in between. And I think historically it has been that way because there's been a little bit lower hanging fruit and better opportunities to just clear spectrum. But what the members that are on Energy and Commerce on the Republican side, what we're really focused on is that agencies just can't come into a conversation and just say no anymore. And I think that is where this conversation really needs to shift, is as we're working with NTIA, as NTIA is working with the agencies, there needs to be a conversation of how to get to yes. And that's something that I have not seen has really been the case in the last several years, especially as we're talking about repurposing opportunities or looking for potential opportunities for commercial use in the federal spectrum space.
Great. We're going to go to questions. Did you have any last thoughts, sorry, on that topic? Nope.
No,
Okay.
I would just plus one
Okay.
for me on that.
Okay, good to know. Questions here in the audience, and then Kate, just a point of inquiry. Where am I supposed to be asking people to send information, or is it on the? Should they be emailing you?
Either to hashtag #AskAEITech or to Owen's email, which is on the event.
Between the two of you, we're going to work on that. The last names. Okay, and please introduce yourself.
Happy to. My name is Patrick Lozada with the Telecommunications Industry Association. Thank you for your remarks today and the vibrant discussion. I had a two-part question focused on capacity in institutions. We've seen a number of the organizations responsible for U.S. engagement on spectrum and international communications issues, specifically the State Department CDP Bureau and the FCC's Space and International Bureau, change how they're organized in the past 2 years. How has that impacted, you think, the U.S.'s position abroad and how we engage at WRC? First part of the question. And secondly, are these agencies and institutions sufficiently resourced and staffed to engage with the complex technical questions raised in these forums?
Any volunteers to take that one?
I'll take the first part. Certainly, I don't think that the rest of the world respectfully cares too much whether there's a space bureau or not a space bureau. I think it's, if it was the decision of the commission to do so, and I applaud that, but I don't know that they look upon that as a big changing significant given the issues that they're tackling. The same thing with State Department. In terms of your resources question, I don't know it's so much about resources as much as about attention. And so I would advocate for an ambassador that's done way in advance, and the coordination between the State Department and FCC is fairly good. But there should be more and it's that corresponds to the executive branch and how they approach the overall treatment of spectrum. This hasn't exactly been forthcoming in this last couple of years. So I think there's fixes to be had, but I don't know if it's much about resources or money being dedicated. I think the active industry that's engaged is really attuned to these issues. And then, as the mayor said, we tend to lose interest after 6 months after a WRC or a year after WRC. We start thinking about the next one, but there's that gully, that valley, that shouldn't exist. And that needs to be improved. I've been advocating for a long time the industry needs to step up its game. I think they really have. They really have been active. They were active in 23. I'm sure there'll be more in 27 as we go forward, to Kate's point, on how spectrum's become more interesting.
I think that's exactly right. I think what some of these reorganizations within the government might reflect is a recognition of the growing interdependencies between some of these issues, especially in spectrum. And so you look at the State Department and how it has reorganized, and you see the connections now between spectrum and equipment security and the supplier base. That Evelyn was talking about. You see all these interdependencies. I think that's what the reorganizations really bring out and make us better positioned to think about. And in terms of resources, I completely agree. I think the FCC, I'll just speak to the FCC since I was most recently there. We had increased the number of staff and resources that were dedicated to things like standards work. And part of the reason for that is, one, we saw the increasing importance of standards development in these issues, and two, we saw other countries dedicating quite a bit of resources to participating in these standard organizations, and we thought we needed an answer to that. And so I think throughout the government we've seen similar responses.
And I'll just quickly add that the most important thing is the interagency collaboration for all of these meetings. And so, it's great to see the recognition with reorganizations. The National Spectrum Strategy and the presidential memo that accompanied that have some additional new structures that are going to be put in place to help decision-making across the interagency, that consensus building process. That's really the most important thing, to try to get the administration on the same page and with all equities considered as they go into these meetings. In terms of resourcing, I would just add that workforce is hugely important here. We can always use more spectrum engineers in the federal government. So, that's a message we have to keep putting forward. Yeah.
Any questions from, okay, Nathan over here? This is going to be, we're at 3:30, so this will be our last question. Unless anybody else dying to ask a question? Just checking, okay.
When I worked on the Hill, we used to have people who would reach out like every week, and we called them frequent flyers. So I'm doing my best frequent flyer impression today.
We'll get you a number before you leave.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So over the past few years, there were a number of actions both the FCC has taken, the White House, Capitol Hill, looking at things like Huawei, ZTE, et cetera. We also have a lot of like international things happening right now. When you think about WRC, which is like a thing that occurs every 4 years, with the rise of like a new Chinese Leo that's competing with American Leos, what, just for, as an example, or TikTok, et cetera, what are some international pain points that you guys foresee happening that, like, if you were a betting person on FanDuel, you're like, this is an area where I expect people to be talking about in 2 years that they're not talking about now? Is there anything off the top of your guys' head that, like, we should be on the lookout for that would be maybe become a topic of conversation next year's the next WRC that we're not thinking about now, or no, just the standard, answers that we give all the time? I just figured I'd ask if there's something new that's on someone else's radar.
Look, it's really going to matter what happens in November, and how whichever administration leads the game. There are some things in my mind that I think that will be important, but some of this is changing on a quicker basis, and having a conference every 4 years makes little sense. So,
Tracy, you want to go?
Yes, so it's hard to know what we don't know, but I just like to throw this in because it hasn't been mentioned today. I'm sure AI will play a part in, what happens the next WRC, and so, working on that issue too. I think it's important to kind of, have a view where we're looking at spectrum, AI, cybersecurity, all of those things kind of rolled up, and, thinking holistically.
Nathan, I think you've been doing this long enough to know we'll still be talking about Legato and all the same things 4 years from now. Nothing changed. No. I think, one thing that I am really interested in watching is so much of the focus within the United States has not so much, but some of the focus has shifted to this idea of dynamic spectrum sharing and doing a test bed and doing a moonshot, and what that will mean domestically for the United States. I'm interested to see what it will mean internationally as well. As what we saw at the World Radiocommunication Conference was still tremendous interest in licensed full power exclusive use spectrum for the rest of the world. And pursuing a different model. What will it mean for our ability to deploy as fast as these other countries, since usually those models require the creation of separate devices, separate base stations? What will it mean for economies of scale for the equipment produced by American countries? So that's something that I'll be looking at least.
I'm excited to see what happens with the national spectrum strategy. As I mentioned, we've been working to try and, pass spectrum legislation and draft spectrum legislation with the other Commerce Committee corners. I think there were some, I know some people have said that they wish the national spectrum strategy was a little bit more aggressive. I don't necessarily disagree, but I also think getting all of those agencies to sign off on a document that large and that aggressive is a pretty big feat, and it helps us in our efforts to try and identify spectrum. So I'm excited to see what happens with that. I also am curious to see what happens over the next year, a year of a presidential election, and going into ending a Congress and going into a new one is always very interesting on Capitol Hill. So stay tuned.
And I don't know if this will catch us by the next WRC, but in addition to AI, I think quantum is going to be something that we'll have to be dealing with, and both on the encryption side, but also what it can help us do, the combination of AI, quantum computing to help us to do spectrum decision-making and management much more facile way, and in collaboration with our international partners in a trusted way.
Well, thank you all very much for all the work you've done in the past and you're going to continue to do. So all of our devices, be it unlicensed or licensed, continue to work. And eventually we're all going to have our own baby Leo up on our rooftop, which is going to be fantastic. So please join me in thanking our panel today.